I am on the board of the Emerge Center, a program founded by our friends at the River Church, whose mission is to equip individuals with education, training, and resources to live a more empowered life through programs that help people take charge of their physical, emotional, and financial health. I met this week with another lay leader to talk about fundraising for the organization, but before we got down to business, we spent some time getting to know each other. Professionally, she is a patient navigator at Duke, helping patients to get transportation to and from appointments, get prescriptions filled and financial assistance, and making sure that doctors and patients understand each other and the illness. It's a very important role. As part of that, she serves also as a screener at the Duke Cancer Center, and I saw her last week as I went with Rabbi Sager for his biweekly chemo treatment. And in our conversation, she told me that she was a 20-year cancer survivor. And she said something to me that I have been thinking about since Thursday when we spoke. She said the following sentence: if I could live my life over again, there are many things I'd ask God to change, but one thing I wouldn't ask God to change is my cancer diagnosis. That experience is one of the reasons I'm a nurse, one of the reasons I do what I do, and I am who I am. And I'm grateful to God for who I've become and the life that I live. At first, her statement set off alarm bells. What do you mean you wouldn't ask God to change your cancer diagnosis? I have lost so many people to this terrible disease, childhood friends, family, most recently our beloved Robert Rosenstein. Part of her statement at first sounded obscene, but part of it I did understand. I told her that so much of my life has been changed by the death of close friends, that while I would give anything to have them back in the world, first and foremost for their families and for me too, years later, I am able to be grateful for how their deaths have shaped the person I've become and the life that I've chosen to live. This week's Torah portion describes the building of the tabernacle, a building or a tent, really, whose primary function is ultimately to bring God's presence into our lives. God says, build me a tabernacle, so I may dwell not in it, the tabernacle, but in them. Build me a tabernacle so I, God, can dwell among you, inside of you. And because this is the purpose of the tabernacle, the rabbis read deep meaning into each and every detail of the tabernacle and its vessels. They said that every material and vessel and color and even the measurements teach us something about how do we bring God's presence into the world and into our lives. And the Kliyakar notices something about the measurements. He says all of the measurements of the ark, and you really have to pay close attention to this, all of the measurements of the ark were in fractions, 2.5 by 4.5, or whatever it was in terms of cubits. And the measurements for the altar were in whole numbers, 3 by 5 or 6 by 10 or whatever it was. And he says this fact relates to what the sages teach regarding virtues. The sages teach, look above you to your superior in spiritual matters. For by doing so, it will appear to us that we are lacking in completeness and have not attained the level of our friends, we will become jealous. And because we're jealous, we say to ourselves, I'm incomplete in some way in my spiritual matters. Then we will crave wisdom. As the rabbis taught, the jealousy of scribes, kinat sofrim marbe chokhmah, increases wisdom. However, he says, in merits of this world, referred to by the table, not the ark. However, in matters of this world, such as wealth and honor, we shouldn't look to those who have, we should look to those who have less. We should see ourselves as whole and complete, like those numbers. And we should look to those who have less and say, I am happy with my lot. And I need to give to others because I have everything that I need. The rabbis also teach that a prayer, when we are praying, we're going to daven Musaf in a few minutes, and the rabbis teach us that when we are praying, we should direct our eyes down and our hearts above. Our eyes down and our hearts above. That's Masechet Yoma 72b, if you want to look it up. When we are praying for our spiritual and physical needs, our hearts should be focused above. We should feel broken. We should feel like fractions. And we should yearn for wisdom. But when we pray for our material needs, we should look down and feel a sense of gratitude for what we have and an obligation for those who are in need more than we are. Sometimes this feels inhuman or superhuman to say and embrace brokenness, to say, I would ask God to change many things, but not my cancer diagnosis. I want to give a few caveats to this approach before using it in the world. Number one, this is never something that you should try to do for another person. Do not. One of the worst things that we can do to someone who is in pain is walk up to them and say, this is part of God's plan. In doing so, you are claiming that you know the mind of God, you're making an idol of yourself, and you're inflicting pain upon someone when they are hurting the most. I heard a teaching about this once when I was younger about brokenness as a pathway to God's presence, and I stayed after and I asked the teacher. At this point, I was in my early 20s. I had been an athlete and I had had a good life. I graduated from college. My friend Jay was sick but had not yet died, and otherwise, while my life wasn't perfect, I felt that I hadn't really known loss. And I asked this teacher if the fact that I didn't feel broken meant that I could not really experience God's presence or have a deep spiritual life. And he said words that I remember to this day. What he said to me is, it doesn't mean that, but you have to make yourself a brother of suffering. Four years ago, I was reading Kaddish by Leon Wieseltier during my year of mourning after my father's death. And he writes, if you have made peace with the human world, you should be ashamed of yourself. When it comes to others, our task is not to make peace with their suffering, but to alleviate it. Not by trying to explain it, but by being present with them in their pain and darkness. And the second caveat is that this takes time. I could not have said those words or this Dvar Torah when my friends Jay and Joel had died, or in the midst of my own wife's illness a few years ago. My friend from the river, as she sat across from me, told me she could not have said those words 20 years ago, or perhaps even 10 when she was still recovering. But there she was, sitting across from me on Zoom, now 60 years old, 20 years later, saying that it's the one thing I would never ask God to take back. I imagine that it's the difference between gratitude and accepting. It's what we mean when we say at a funeral, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, a blessing, when we are not saying, I'm so grateful for this moment, God, but we acknowledge the presence of God in the overwhelming bigness of what has happened as a moment that overflows its borders, and an acceptance of this moment in all of its fullness. In material matters, God's presence enters our lives when we say the words that Jacob said to his brother so many years later, and me, yesh li kol, I have all that I need. And when we give, as we should this week, and especially on Purim, matanot le'evunim, to those who are in need, a special mitzvah. We invite God's presence into our lives by being whole and giving to those who need more. And in spiritual matters, at least one way that God's presence comes into our lives is in fractions, when we see and embrace our brokenness. My friend from the Emerge Center was my teacher in faith this week. I'm grateful that she shared her story with me, and I pray that it gives you as much to think about as it did me. Shabbat Shalom.